Welcome back, everybody. We are here once again for another incredible interview. This is going to be a great one, guys. One that you're going to want to stick around for because we are going to be getting into a very important, what I feel is extremely important topic. And this is a topic and a conversation I think more people should be having. I know I have this conversation many times online, but also in, up close and personal with people. I seem to with my friends and then people I've talked to and even people I meet on the street, I kind of bring this up if I can, and then we get into sometimes a great discussion, but it leads in so many different directions. I'm finding that people have their own beliefs, they got their own thoughts, and it's really when you start diving into the topic that we're going to be getting into, people are very divided. People have their own ideas. And I just wanted to bring a guest on that was going to be able to break this down. We're going to have this discussion. I think it's so important that this discussion is being had, and it needs to be had more because I really, truly do believe that this is at the root of all of the problems that are going on around the world. I always see people talking about the symptoms. They're explaining everything. They know the symptoms. They know things are wrong, but they never really get below that and start going at the root. And me being a gardener, I'm always, when I'm weeding, going for the root because I know that's how I'm going to get rid of the problem. So that's the way I attack kind of information. If there's a problem, I want to know the root cause of it. So I'm going to bring on my guest who's going to break this down. We're going to have a great conversation. We're going to have a great talk, and we're going to be talking about government and slavery. And is government slavery? Are we living in a slave system? These are uncomfortable topics that people don't sometimes even like to address, but we're going to do it this show, guys. So I'm going to stop talking, get my guest on here. Welcome to the show, Alexander Raskovic. I probably butchered the last name. I do apologize, but I got close. And sorry, I do apologize, Alexander, but welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here to discuss this. I want to dive right into this and just ask the question. I want you to break it down for us about, is government slavery and do we live in a slave system?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rick. It's an honor.
Thank you.
Well, the definition of slavery is one person owning another person. Well, then the question comes up, what is ownership? Ownership is the exclusive right to decide what is done with something. And in the case of slavery, it is the exclusive right to decide what is done with someone. So we have learned that the person who owns the other person is called a slave master. And the person who is owned by the slave master is called a slave, and we all know that. So the master decides what the slave can or cannot do with his own body. He can decide how much the slave is allowed to keep of the fruits of his own labor. He can decide what the slave is allowed or not allowed to do. The decision is for the slave master to make. The one with the supposed right to decide over another is the slave master. The one with the supposed obligation to obey is the slave. Mm-hmm. And that is basically slavery in a nutshell. And we all know, well, hopefully all of us know, that slavery is inherently wrong. Now, when we learn about slavery, we do not learn how a slave master acquired the supposed right to rule another person as his slave. One of the assumptions that people frequently make is that people thought that white skin tones were superior to dark skin tones, and that gave the people with white skin tones the right to rule and control the people with dark skin tones as they see fit. Mm-hmm. Yet that is not what gave them the supposed right to do so, obviously. The practice that gave people with white skin tones the right to own people with dark skin tones was that it was made into law. So it was legal. And of course, those are very respected terms. When something is legal and made into law, then it is to be respected. It is to be fervently revered. Yet slavery is and was not to be respected, but it was legal. It was permitted by way of the law. So we immediately see a contradiction. So when something is made into law or becomes legal, that doesn't mean that it's righteous or moral. But we all unquestioningly assume that it is. Mm-hmm. Slavery was unrighteous and immoral, yet it was the law. It was legal. So right and moral is not synonymous with legal. Just because something is made into law doesn't mean that it's right.
Exactly.
Now, why is that? What happens when something becomes law or becomes legal? What happens when something becomes legal or becomes the law? How does something become the law? And incidentally, how does something that is inherently wrong, like slavery, become the law? Well, it is actually quite simple, and it is a bunch of mere human beings like you and I who call themselves politicians come together in large, majestic buildings and have a vote, and then write something down on a piece of paper and now call that scribble on a piece of paper the law.
Yep.
And then they send their law enforcers out to enforce it. Or more specifically, they pay a bunch of people to unquestioningly impose that on other people. To say that a practice like that can turn wrongful behavior like slavery or any wrongful behavior into right behavior is completely irrational. Based on that premise alone, anybody can repeat the same thing. Likewise, people can come together and write something down on a piece of paper, call it the law, and would impose that on others without their permission. Mm-hmm. Yet, if anybody other than these politicians actually did that, people would call that insane, and those people who started demanding money from people under the threat of violence because they wrote it down on a piece of paper and called it the law would probably get shot or injured.
I agree.
But the question that nobody asks is how is it not insane when these politicians do it? We know that when they do it, that doesn't make it moral or just, and slavery is a testament to that. And the point that I wanted to make is that slavery was made possible because a group of people wrote down on a piece of paper that slave masters had the right to rule and control other people as their slaves. What we do not learn is that the very same principles that define slavery still apply even when you decide to change the titles of the slave master or the slave. Let's take that same sentence that we just used. Let's say that the law, the scribble on a piece of parchment, now gave the slave masters the right to rule and control people as their slaves. Only let's replace the word slave master with government and replace the word slave as citizens. Now immediately people will say, well, you can't just do that. Well, I do, because nothing has changed apart from the names. The government decides what the citizen can or cannot do with his own body. Yep. It can decide how much the citizen is allowed to keep of the fruits of his own labor. It can decide what the citizen is allowed or not allowed to do. The decision is for the government to make. The one with the supposed right to decide over another is the government. And the one with the supposed obligation to obey the government is the citizen. It's the exact same thing as the slave and the slave master, and it is made into law. What's really going to cook your noodle is if the law didn't mean anything because slavery was still wrong, regardless of the law, does government mean anything since law does not mean that it's right?
That's a great question. Wow. And I just want to add in, Alexander, that I was thinking about this a lot coming with this interview coming up. And I remember when I was very young talking to my parents, and I remember asking adults around me, like, okay, like, I just remember saying, like, okay, who makes the police follow these rules? Who makes the rules? Basically, was my question. Like, and my parents, when I was young, they would just give me the simple answer, like, oh, okay, well, the government makes the rules, and then the police officers enforce them. And I was like, oh, okay, but like, and then I would kind of remember like thinking, well, how do these people get into government? Like how, like to make the rules? And my parents would say, well, they're elected by the people. They elect them in, and then they make the rules, and they have our best interest at mind most of the time. And then that was a pretty good answer for a young kid. I just go, okay, I just thought that was the way things were. And then as I got older and grew up and started, learning, then I kind of thought the first thing I started to learn was, okay, who gave them the right to do we have the right to give them this right to this very big right to a bunch of people to make these laws? And then you slowly learn that you can't give away a right that you don't even have. So then that's when you really
Exactly.
get into this whole government thing. So I just wanted to add that in because I just remember asking adults growing up, like, who makes the rules, kind of, and then it was like, well, we vote them in, and that's kind of, so I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for chiming in there. And we can make it even more uncomfortable.
Cool.
If you do something that the law does not permit you to do, then you are labeled as a criminal.
Yep.
Back then, there were lots of people who helped slaves escape the slave masters through the Underground Railroads. Yet that was against the law, which means that they were criminals for helping the slaves get free. Slaves who disobeyed their slave masters were also labeled as criminals. When a slave did not do what the slave master told him, then that was a crime. Now, does the label criminal or crime mean anything when the supposed criminal is doing the right thing? Now, we can make it even more uncomfortable. If the slaves and the people who tried to free them through the Underground Railroad physically resisted law enforcers or police for trying to arrest them, would they be morally justified in doing so? Because crime does not mean that they're actually doing something wrong, and could even be the right thing to do, like freeing slaves.
Right.
If yes, does law enforcement or police mean anything when you're fighting for the right thing? I.e., would it be morally justified if you openly resisted law enforcement, since the law they are trying to enforce can often be something that is wrong, like slavery was? And this gets into a very deep rabbit hole, a place where most people have never looked at inside of their own beliefs concerning government and authority. Supposed authority.
That's a good way to put
Because we are taught to revere those ideas and to unquestionably assume their legitimacy. And this begs the question, is government even legitimate, and do we even need it? And that opens up a whole lot of concerns and questions, but it doesn't have to be complicated to answer them. It doesn't have to be complicated to answer them at all. There are only two ways in which people interact with each other. One is by mutual agreements, and the other is by one person using threats or violence to force his will upon another. One can be called voluntary interaction, and the other can be labeled involuntary interaction. Well, we already know that forcing one's will upon another by using threats or violence is wrong. And we've also seen that scribbles on a piece of parchment or changing the way you say you're going to violently force your will upon another do not change the fact that you're still forcing your will upon another with violence, and that it's still wrong. Now, in which category does government belong? Is it voluntary or is it involuntary? I.e., does it force you to do things against your will using threats of violence? Or is it just a service provider or organization that you can choose to participate with by way of your own free will?
Right.
I'm pretty sure that nobody would say that it's the latter. It's
I hope
obviously
not.
the former.
They want to sell it as that in a way, right? Like they're kind of selling it as that. But when you really look at it, it's definitely they use violence and coercion. If we're being honest, that's what they're doing. That's what they rely on. But I think most people, a lot of people I talk to, they kind of get that in a way, but they're like, we need them. Of course there's some corruption, and that's a whole rabbit hole to go down. But I get what you're saying totally, and they try to sell it as a good thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Rick, are you still there?
I still am. Are you?
Okay. I thought I lost you. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good.
No, we're definitely going to dive into that, Rick. Don't worry. But there is a specific distinction that makes governments, and that is the supposed right to force people to behave a certain way, and force people to pay for something against their will. And because people wouldn't feel justified in doing those sort of things on their own, They want there to be a government so that it can have that ability to force other people to behave a certain way or force people to pay for something that they think is a good idea. But there's obviously a contradiction there. People wouldn't go to their neighbor's door to force them to pay for the infrastructure or an education system under threat of dragging him away from his friends and family and locking him up in a cage. Right. No decent human being would feel justified in doing that on their own. Now, if you wouldn't do that on your own, why would you vote for a government to do that for you instead, in the form of taxation, so that it can spend it on the infrastructure or the education system that you prefer? Immediately, that sets many people off. Like, yeah, why do I do that, actually? That is because they've been trained during all their years of schooling, well, so-called schooling, that if you vote for somebody else to do it, it's okay, when it's obviously not. They've never been told why or how that suddenly makes something blatantly wrong, like stealing, into a right by calling it taxation and by writing it down on a piece of paper that a group of politicians now possesses the right to do so. They've been told that that is how it is, that is how it's always been. So therefore, you have to unquestionably memorize it and repeat back to me that makes it okay. Otherwise, you won't pass the grade system, and you don't want to disappoint your parents and become a failure, do you? Now, those reasons are not rational. There's already two logical fallacies in there, in fact. The appeal to common practice, and the appeal to fear. So it's just being inculcated. Schools are instilling these ideas into the minds of children and are setting the condition for them to become comfortable with it. And occasionally you'll have that troublemaker classmate that chooses to follow his own judgment and moral conscience instead of doing what he's told, and they'll make an example out of him and try to convince you that you don't want to be like that. Yeah. You want to be good at doing what you're told. You want to be good at memorizing and regurgitating what the teacher tells you. And you never want to take matters into your own hands, and you always have to defer to authority to settle disputes. Yeah. And ultimately, people are trained to never question authority. And that's why people never ask the question, how does a politician attain the right to make decisions over my life and steal my money without my consent? How does changing the way he's going to steal my money and threatening me with violence if I don't let him do that actually make it morally okay for him to do so? How come it's okay for him to do immoral things when it would be wrong if I did the exact same thing on my own? And this is the key behind this type of indoctrination, and this is very, very important. Children are trained to never take any matters into their own hands. Always defer to authority and let it solve the problems for you. You don't go out of your way to try and solve it on your own, or we will punish you. Mm-hmm. Even if your idea is a way better idea than theirs and makes much more sense than that of the authorities, you must sit still and be silent, because we are your authorities and we decide what it's going to be, not you. So whenever people contemplate life without a government, a group of politicians, and because that's all it is, that are just mere mortal human beings like you and me, who can make mistakes and can have stupid ideas, or can even become corrupt, who supposedly have the right to decide what everybody can or cannot do, and steal people's money, and who will also have a large group of order followers who will enforce whatever they're told to enforce without question, so that it can impose its will on everybody else and can do violence unto people who disobey. They often wonder out loud, well, how would this work without governments? Or this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. They do not realize what they're actually saying. If we specify those questions in literal terms, this is how they would sound, Rick. Okay. How we build the roads if some people don't have the right to steal people's money so that it can pay companies to build the roads?
Yeah, I've heard that one many times.
How will we care for the poor if we don't give a small group of people the right to steal our money, waste some of it, and give the remainder to the poor?
Yep.
How will we defend ourselves against thieves if we don't let a small group of people steal our money to pay other people to protect us against thieves?
Yep.
I mean, these are not rational questions. People don't naturally come up with these. Once again, it is because people have been trained to never come up with their own solutions and to always rely on authority to impose a centralized master plan on everybody else using threats of violence. I mean, building the roads, is it really hard to figure that out? If people can invent very advanced things like a car, don't you think we're able to figure out how to build a flat surface on which cars can drive? I mean, the last time I checked, it wasn't the politicians who built the roads, it was companies who were paid with money that was stolen from us. Don't you think we're able to organize and use our own money to pay those companies ourselves so that they can build the roads without it being stolen from us? Yep. And that is the whole point. People also say, well, it's because we're social creatures, therefore we need to have governments. And that is another example of one statement and then a flying leap to something that does not follow logically from the previous statements. Yeah, we're social creatures, therefore we need a centralized ruling class imposing its will on all of us using threats of violence. That does not follow. It is an indoctrinated response. It isn't something they would come up with their own. It isn't something they would come up on their own because it's simply not rational to say that. Picture yourself. Excuse me. Picture yourself and 50 others on an uncharted island. We have no idea how we got here. This is the situation. This is what is. Now, which one of the two scenarios would be the natural way for people to respond? Scenario 1. People come together, they organize, they try to figure out, they try and figure out, well, he's good at that, she's good at that, and I'm good at this, so we could figure out ways to trade with each other and homestead and survive as equals. And surely we will have disagreements about certain things, but we can figure out ways to find a good compromise and deal with things as adults. Well, that seems very reasonable.
Sounds good, yeah.
So, or scenario 2. We say, well, this person right here gets to own the entire island and gets to receive a decent amount of everything anybody makes or produces without having to produce anything himself, and he shall have the right to decide how we can or cannot live our lives, what we can or cannot do with our own body, and who gets to own what. And we will appoint 10 of us to unquestionably enforce all of his arbitrary commands on all the rest of us and do violence unto those who don't do what he says. I'm pretty sure that almost nobody would pick scenario 2. Yet that's the very thing they're arguing for when they say that there should be a government.
Great point.
Peaceful cooperation and organization based on mutual consent is not the same as government. Government is rulership, and I will briefly make the distinction between true leadership and rulership. Perfect. Because government is always confused with leadership. It is actually nothing of the kind. Yes, a lot of people want to defer to a leader, someone who has leadership skills or someone who is just very good at doing something, and he can guide those people with his knowledge on how to do that particular thing. Because yes, some people would prefer that rather than having to figure it out for themselves. For instance, this person knows how to organize things in a particular way or knows how to build something very well, and he has a lot of good ideas. So a lot of people might go, well, let's just listen to what he says, and if it makes sense, then yeah, let's do that. But when a leader lets people do things that are not benefiting them at all, or lets people do things that don't even work or are even counterproductive, and let's say that he even becomes corrupt and starts letting people do things that are only serving himself, well then quickly nobody will follow him anymore, ever, because he will be remembered for his very bad reputation. Yep. But a leader is always chosen voluntarily, based on his reputation and reliability. That is the basis of true leadership. If people voluntarily decide to defer to a leader and participate in his plan, then they are free to do so, and they are free to leave if they so choose. If I choose to be my own leader and be self-reliant and self-responsible, then I can choose to do that as well. Now, that is very different from rulership.
Absolutely.
A ruler is someone who doesn't care whether you want to follow him or not, whether you like his reputation or not, because he will force you to do what he says under the threat of brute violence. Now, of course, they invented democracy, where the majority of the people can choose a ruler, assuming that a majority can make decisions for a minority somehow, which doesn't.
Yeah, which, that's like, how? Like, who gave them the right to even do that? But that's how they sell it. And you make great points out. I love what you're saying, Alexander. You're breaking this down perfect. And I'm so happy that you're doing this, because you're really making it that people can think about this and ask these questions, and then come to, like, what you're saying makes total sense. And I've had that too. When you brought up the roads thing, I've had all of that thrown at me when I get into the government. It's like, well, who's going to take care of the roads? Who's going to take care of the schools? And on and on and on. They want to make their excuses for it. And then I've said exactly what you said, that you don't need to, like, it will just happen. Like, I mean, if the roads, I just see a society where if the roads need fixing, people that know how to fix roads will just fix them. And you know,
exactly.
you'll work out a cost, or you'll barter, you'll do it, but it will get done. And I see the same thing with all of these questions, that you're going to have people that love teaching, and they're going to want to teach. They're going to be doing it, and they're going to be valued, and then they're going to teach. And you're not going to have this what they call teaching now, because you bring up also a great point, just to kind of bring it back to when you're talking about young children, how they're indoctrinated into the system. And I was one of those guys that when you were saying, you know, you have your troublemaker, I put my hand up. I was like, that was me. I was asking questions. I drove the teachers crazy. And you know, they kind of say, oh, we like when you ask questions. No, that's kind of a half truth. They like when you ask questions about what they're teaching, but if you have something that goes out of their curriculum and they can't answer it, then I was always in trouble with the principal. My parents were being called because I asked questions and I didn't just blindly follow. But I think of the regiment that you brought up, and I just think from the time we're in the school system, you got the bell going off. You have to line up. You're in a class for a certain amount of time. Like, they very much are gearing you for that rulership, is what I'm trying to get at. And it's very young. So you bring up great points. I just wanted to add that in, and then I totally get what you're saying. Like, I just see it. We don't need government, because it would turn into a voluntary system, and I think people have a hard time seeing that, and that's where that's where I see it, is that people they have a really hard time not having, it's like they want to be ruled, if that makes sense. They want to put all that responsibility on the government. And does that make sense?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily, I agree that people love the comfort of that people crave the comfort of certainty, but you know, we might be able to get into this later during the conversation. Okay. If you ask people certain questions, then people already know. Like what I said before, of course, people love certainty. People love comfort, and they would rather delegate a lot of things to other people so that they don't have to think about it. But would you do things like that on your own? Would you go to your neighbor's door and demand money from him so that that money can be used to fund your child's education, or build the roads, or for a defense system? If you wouldn't do that on your own, you know, I'm pretty sure when people understand that by a very particular way of questioning, then you will see that none of them actually believe, and this is the contradiction in their own head, none of them actually believe what they've been trained to believe. But surely we will get into more depth into that later on. Perfect. But like you said just yet, you know, like, because of people's concerns, you know, it's, you know, obviously what you just said about the roads, people who want to have good roads they will have good roads because people will put their money on it.
Yep.
If people want good roads, they will spend their money on good roads. And that's exactly the way people are doing it now. It's just not centrally imposed on people with violence. And even though, it wouldn't be just to say, well, we don't want to have slavery. Well, that's absurd, but who will pick the cotton if there wasn't slavery? So it's the principle that is what matters the most, and that is what matters most. And to get back to like democracy,
Okay.
if just to briefly, I lost my train of thought.
I'm sorry. I hope I didn't do that.
Yeah, no worry. I'm back here, but like a majority giving consent for a minority obviously doesn't make sense as well. I can't give my consent for somebody else to be robbed for the mere reason that I agreed to it, but he didn't. Like, oh, I agree that you get to rob my neighbor, even though he doesn't agree with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's such an extremist sometimes. And that is true. That is true whether it's 10 people giving consent for somebody else to be robbed, or 100 or 1 million. Wrong behavior stays wrong regardless of how many people want it to be right. But, back to the point, when the appointed ruler suddenly becomes corrupt or starts spending people's money on things that don't benefit anybody but himself, or lets people do things that they would rather not do, or rather not want to do, well, then you're out of luck. Mm-hmm. You can't just choose not to follow him anymore or spend your money on things that you do value, because the ruler will send armed mercenaries after you to kick down your door, drag you away from your friends and family, and lock you up in a cage for tax evasion. Yep. Of course, you can whine and beg at a protest and yell that they shouldn't do that, but they'll just ignore you or send their armored thugs to brutally attack you with sticks, water cannons, and rubber bullets. Mm-hmm. I mean, and you better be grateful that you get to choose your ruler, and that you might get a nicer ruler at the next election if you're lucky. And this is just gambling with life. It has nothing to do with cooperation and organization. It is duress and oppression. Now, which one is government? A ruler? A centralized master plan imposed on everybody else under the threat of violence? Or leader, who is chosen based on his reputation and reliability? Well, the answer will seem pretty obvious. Yep. And the point is that a centralized authority on everything is never better than voluntary mutual agreements. It is literally the worst idea ever, and we see it over and over again. And this is all the term anarchy means. No rulership. It doesn't mean no leadership, no organization, no cooperation, and every man for himself. The one thing that matters above all else is free will, is choice. And when you have the ability to decide for yourself what you do with your own life and what you spend your own money on, then that's called freedom. If we're not transgressing upon anybody else's freedom and live our lives the way we want to live it, without a centralized authority claiming the right to decide that for us, that transgresses upon our freedom if we don't let them, then that is true liberty. Mm-hmm. Liberty is voluntary. And nobody can ever attain the right to rob you of that liberty. Politicians never rightfully acquired the right to claim ownership of thousands of square miles of land that was already occupied, by the way, as their territory or jurisdiction to rule and exploit as they see fit, and boss everybody else around who lives in that area they claim to rule or own. How does a handful of ordinary people get to say, this huge area right here, often half of an entire continent, is now ours, and we will decide what people can or cannot do in this area? Yep. And we will steal people's money without their consent, because the fact that you're living here already counts as implied consent. Why? Because we made that up and wrote it down on a piece of parchment. And if you don't like it, you can get out. You can go to some other area that somebody else claimed as their territory and be bossed around by them. And if you're lucky, you might find an owner who will allow you to be more free than the others. And if I went to, and I went into this in a lot in great depth in my video called "Is Democracy the Same as Freedom?" which I really advise everyone to watch.
I'll
But
post a link in the description of this for that video, so that way people can check it and then find it in the description, guys.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Perfect.
But this is just a bunch of people claiming ownership of an entire area as their plantation and ruling over people who live in that area as their slaves, telling them how much they can keep of what they earn, telling them what they can or cannot do with their own body, telling them how they must live their lives, and using threats of violence against anybody who disobeys the politicians. Nobody naturally comes up with this idea. Of course, this opens up the discussion about how someone could own land, since land is not something mankind has built or produced, so nobody by default has the inherent right to decide what is to be done with all of the land. Yeah. It is entirely natural, and you cannot trade with nature for a bit of land. So yeah, this is a bit of a grey area indeed. But to point to that grey area and to say, well, it's not easy to develop a cohesive standard by which land could be owned by people, so therefore this tiny group of people should have the right to own all of it, and they should have the right to take our money without our consent and boss us around and tell us how we can or cannot live our lives. That entire argument does not follow. It is logically fallacious. It is a non sequitur, which means it does not follow. And this is how people normally try to solve problems or figure things out. Like I've said in the example of the islands. It is not a natural response. It is an indoctrinated response. Mm-hmm. And another thing that people worry about is, if there wasn't a ruling class, is, well, what about foreign invaders coming into the area and attacking people and eventually ruling over people? Yep. What if you have an invasion by China or the UN or Genghis Khan with advanced warfare equipment? Well, what would you do about it with a government? You would have a large group of people who are very skilled with firearms and who are trained in tactical combat. Only they would be called the troops of the government, who have to do whatever the politicians command them to do without question, even when they are now going to be the ones who have to invade another area to unquestionably molest and murder people who the politicians order them to molest and murder. Now, without a ruling class, you would have a large group of people who are very skilled with firearms and are trained in tactical combat. Mm-hmm. It seems very familiar. Only this time, it's the exact same people, but they just work as a militia or private security company that defends against imperialists. The only difference is that troops have to unquestionably follow the orders of a bunch of politicians, the very same premise, by the way, that a foreign invasion is based upon. People who have to unquestionably follow the commands of politicians to wage war and start an invasion, but somewhere else, and they come to invade you. Yep. So the government's argument is basically this: if we peacefully coexist with each other, based on mutual agreements and voluntary interaction, then some other people that are located somewhere else, who do have a ruling class that steals people's money and bosses them around, will send lots of armed enforcers to come here and rule over us and steal our money and boss us around. Mm-hmm. So therefore, in order to prevent a ruling class from bossing us around and stealing our stuff, we need to have a ruling class that bosses us around and steals our stuff. Brilliant idea. Nothing could be more self-contradictory. And to say that we cannot have it, the voluntary way, and that we need to have something centrally imposed on everybody, and that we need to forcibly take people's money because I want my safety to be guaranteed, is another stupid idea that worked out so well throughout history. Just not for you. If someone else's freedom has to be sacrificed to guarantee your own safety, so be it. And that is the very same premise of every tyrannical regime that has ever persisted throughout history, and has continued to persist today, like 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And And again, nobody naturally comes up with these ideas. It is that we've been trained to believe that we cannot live or survive without being ruled over by politicians, which is insane. It is not a natural response to the world's problems, it is a programmed response. Because people grow up in schools that incessantly batter them in the head with always do as you're told and always defer to authority. Never try to solve problems or deal with situations on your own. You're inferior. You're the subject class. You're not able to make your own decisions and be in charge of your own life. You're not smart enough to spend your own money. If you want to do something, then you need permission. You need the permission of your superiors. And if they say that you're not allowed to do something, then it is a crime to disobey and do it anyway. Because you're disregarding their authority over you. They decide what is to be done with you. They decide what you're allowed or not allowed to do. They decide how much you can keep of the fruits of your own labor. The decision is theirs to make. And that's how it is and how it always will be. Well, excuse me, Mrs. Teacher. Aren't these authorities, so-called, just mere humans like you and me? Well, yeah, so? So they are authority. They are governments. And you and I are not. So they can boss people around, make people do things that they don't want to do, and steal people's money using threats of violence? Yet you and I cannot do that to them? Well, no, they would lock us up in a cage if we did that. So this group of ordinary people, these politicians, can just randomly walk up to people on the street and demand money from them using threats of violence? Oh no, they can't do that. They can only do that when they're working for the government. Wait, you just said that they are governments.
Right.
But now you're saying that they're working for the government? But then what is government? Where is it? Is the building the government? Well, no. But, well, point to it then. Where is it? What is this thing that can make a group of ordinary mortal people order everybody else around and steal their money? Well, there was a constitution. You mean a bunch of people who died ages ago wrote down on a piece of parchment that a group of people shall have the right to rule and control other people and take their money without their consent, and call that governments, and call the practice of stealing people's money taxation. Whereas, if I would do the exact same thing and wrote down on a piece of paper that I had the right to rule and control other people's lives and take people's money without their consent, then I would be scoffed at.
For sure.
And people would think that I'm insane and that I belong in a mental institution.
Absolutely.
This whole idea of government and authority is nothing more than a complete religion. It is a deity that you cannot point to, that has rights that nobody else has, that issues commands that it is a sin to disobey. And by the way, don't make any graven images of it by doing the same things that it does, writing things down on a piece of paper and calling things taxation instead of stealing, or else they'll make an example out of you. It is the religion that a few people can have the exclusive right to decide what is done with other people. And do you remember what it's called when someone has the exclusive right to decide what is done with something? Or someone in this case?
Slavery.
It's called ownership. Yeah, it's called ownership. And when one person has the exclusive right to decide what is done with another person, then he is implying that he is the owner of that person. He will decide what that person can or cannot do with his own body. He will decide how much he can keep of the fruits of his own labor, that he gave his own time and efforts, essentially a part of his life, essentially a part of his own life in exchange for it. He will decide what choices he can or cannot make. He will decide what decisions he must make. And when one person owns another, then that is the very definition of slavery, like you said, Rick. Whether we're talking about an American citizen or a ball and shackle slave of the 1800s. The premise is still the same. The slave master still decides what the slave can or cannot do. The slave master still decides how much a slave can keep of what he produces. and the slave master still decides what the slave may or may not do with his own body. What is the difference between the chattel slave and the American citizen, or any citizen for that matter? Is it because the slave master calls himself government and calls his plantation the United States of America and calls his slaves the American citizens? So by changing the titles, that makes it not slavery? Because the government allows the American citizen to keep more of what he produced? Because the politicians allow the American citizen to be more free? And to have more rights and to be able to make more choices in life compared to the chattel slave? Where is the difference?
Great point.
I mean, or excuse me. Yeah, well, there is well, when did the very actions that constitute slavery not become slavery anymore? It never did, and there is no difference. The slavery of today is still the same as that of old. The ball that is chained to your foot is just a little bit lighter than the ball that was chained to the foot of the chattel slave in the 1800s. Yeah. Of course, his ball was heavier, and you have a more convenient life because your ball is lighter, but that doesn't mean you're free. And we come full circle, my friend.
That's a great point, too, and I've always thought about, when you think of slavery, it's exactly what you said, Alexander, that people think of the ball and chain. And what I've always thought is, at least back then they could see the ball and chain and they knew that they were a slave. What I mean when I say that is, it's almost worse now in a way because we don't even see our ball and chain. That what they've done is got rid of the image of it. You don't actually physically see it, but they've enslaved our mind. That's what I've always thought about. Is like they're enslaving our mind, which is you can't see it. So it's really genius what they did, but it's so scary what they did because now people can't even see that they're slavery. And when you bring up these things, they get very uncomfortable because they don't want to hear it. Especially when you bring up that government is a religion, that really puts a fire under people's ass. Sometimes I've got into some good ones on that one, but you broke it down perfectly. But it's like, would you not agree that they're enslaving our mind? So we've traded in the actual ball and chain, and you bring up a great point. It's the one we have now is definitely you can't see it. It's a lot lighter. It's still there though.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually the only thing that matters. When a person is not free inside their own head, then he cannot be free in his own body because if he believes that he has a moral obligation to obey a slave master or a government in this instance, then he still thinks that he has a moral obligation to obey and that someone else has the supposed right to rule over him and make decisions over him. And that makes him a slave in his own head. And he will go along by way of his own free will because he thinks that he has a moral obligation to do that. But once people understand that there is no such thing as a moral obligation to obey another human being, let alone a government and a group of politicians, that's when people will be that's actually where most of us have been. That's where the phrase "free your mind" comes from.
Exactly.
You're free from the idea that you don't have an obligation to obey anybody, and that nobody has the supposed right to rule you and control you and make decisions for you using threats of violence, because that's an illusion. There is no such right to control other people. There is no right to use violence against other people. There is no exemption from morality. It is an idea that has been ensconced into people, like we just discussed. At the time you're very young, people are trained to believe that they have this supposed moral obligation to obey, and that someone else has the right to rule, and that they don't own themselves, and that they don't. Yeah, practically speaking, that they are just how could I say? What words am I using? What words am I looking for here?
I'm trying. I just look at it as that from the young age, they really hammer that in, and you brought that up earlier, which is a great point that they bring that in, that authority figure, and I think about it. It starts like right from the time you're born, because I really think about this a lot, like. you have your parents, you look at them as an authority figure. And then so you're learning there. And then if you have bad parents, that's a whole different show. Then you're really behind the eight ball, as they say. Your parents, then you go to a daycare, which is they're sending kids to school younger, and like these daycares younger and younger. So you got that authority figure. Then you go to a public school, and on and on and on. But you're always bombarded with this authority figure that you have to follow, and I think that's the reason they do testing, because it's so entraining in your mind that you have to please the authority. And
Exactly.
it's nonstop from the time we're born. If you're really being honest, that is what they're drilling into your mind. And I think people have a hard time realizing that there is another, what we're speaking about. You can live as a free person. And definitely maybe you could even touch on the non-aggression principle too, because that's key. As long as you're living your life and you're not infringing on anyone's rights and you're using the non-aggression principle, that's the way it should be. But it's not.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with you there, Rick. And it's, what you just brought up is that children are never taught to use their own judgments. They're never
Exactly.
taught to make their own decisions. They're never used to making their own decisions. They're always used to deferring to someone else.
Hmm.
And, that's essentially when people never learn how to take their own responsibility, especially for their own lives. Because when people, this is one of the primary reasons why people have to delegate and abdicate responsibility, if you will. It's because they don't have to feel that they don't have to be responsible, because hey, I'm just
Correct.
doing what he tells me, and
Exactly.
you can't blame me. I just did what he told me, and that's it's
Just
kind of
following
it goes
orders.
both.
That's what you hear.
Exactly,
Just
yeah.
following orders. How many atrocities in history have been caused by that phrase? I just think about that
Oh
all the
well.
time. Just following orders. You hear it even now. In the new, watch the media. You're going to hear it eventually when you're looking for it. I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told, and it's like, wow, like that's not good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're still using the Nazi excuse.
We are, yeah, very
And
very powerful.
yeah,
Jeez.
but it's, obviously because the education system is based on the Prussian education
Yep.
system, which is an outcome based education, which is made to make children malleable for the subjugation of a ruling class, basically. And that's, what the grade system is for. And that's what, the testing and all of that. Obviously, like when you learn things about being self taught and autodidacticism and learning things by yourself, you'd be amazed at how efficient you would be.
Hmm.
I mean, a child learning how to learn things and discover things on their own. I mean, they can, instead of, what children are being taught today is never make your own conclusions. We are going to tell you what your conclusions should be because we are the authority of truth, so to speak.
Yeah,
And
that's scary.
that has always led people astray, especially as we've seen in the last few years. People, don't shirk the responsibility of actually giving, entertaining the idea that there are other causes for certain things,
Hmm.
or that something else is going on. But instead of doing that, and instead of actually using their own brains to actually figure things out for themselves, they just defer to someone else and just want to, remain in a state of, just mental passivity. Well,
Like just
mental,
block.
yeah,
Like just
yeah,
I just
just
yeah.
just want to be turned off and just watch the telly and watch entertain yourself with all the nonsense that's on the internet these
Yeah.
days. Not that I'm wholeheartedly against entertainment, but when people do it as a way of escaping reality, so to speak, that's when you get into things like this.
Exactly. I totally agree. I try to tell people that too about technology. Even I get it's being used against us and in an evil way. Is a great way to put it. And I get that, and I believe that for a lot of years. It was probably why I didn't even like tech. For a long time, I kind of stayed away from it, and because I just saw what they were doing to people with it, and especially with the children, I've done shows on that, like how people are younger and younger and younger. You see children with phones, and they're staring at their phones, and I'm just like, and you see
Yeah.
parents handing over, like they're basically letting tech and the internet and social media raise their children. It keeps their kids quiet. They throw, and I've seen it in my own life. People that basically just give a tablet or a phone to their child, it keeps them quiet, and they're just being raised by that. So I mean, that's a whole different subject. But I'm just saying, I get what you're saying. Like, we can use tech and these things that we're talking about in a good way, and I'm not against entertainment either. But when you like you said, when you're using it as an escape, that's when you have a problem. And I think you can use entertainment. For me, I'm always watching documentaries or podcasts, or I'm always trying to educate myself. So it's really where you focus your attention, I think, is important.
Yeah, exactly. It's a double-edged sword, as many
Exactly.
people have said. It's obviously, there's nothing wrong with, well, I would say that, entertaining yourself should come as a sort of, yeah, a prize. Like, okay, you've deserved it. You've worked hard. Now we can entertain ourselves. But if people are incessantly entertaining themselves, they get into this dopamine rush hunt,
Yeah.
and they essentially become, that's very, very bad for you as well. Because, even if people look into, what that type of mentality does to you, eventually, it's going to get you into various modalities of thought and
Mm-hmm.
of depression and unsatisfaction, and you're going to become very lazy as well. So that's very it does require, a bit of responsibility.
For
But
sure.
no, well, what you've said about technology, technology is not the issue, because you and I are making this very show. Well, we are doing this together by way of technology. It's surely myself, I love nature. I love to be out in
Me
nature. I love
too.
nothing more. I don't like to sit around at home too much and focus on too many things. But when things have to be done, things have to be done. And it is the case that by way of the internet, we have been able to reach so many more people than, if we're talking 50 years ago or something, because
Yeah.
that's eventually, that's a reason to hope. That's a reason why we shouldn't have any despair. Of course, this is a very, very slow process of people gradually understanding that there is no such right to rule other people, and there is no exemption from morality, and that no scribbles on pieces of parchment and majorities of people, or changing the way you say that you're going to do something wrong onto people, gives people the right to do something wrong.
Yeah.
It very gradually is going to be widespread, because more people are talking about these sort of things right now. But that's all by way of the internet. I mean, back in the day, the only way that you could inform yourself was by way of the telly.
That's so
and who
true.
get and guess who runs guess who decides what you get to watch on the telly?
Yep.
And it's today, you're able to explore a vast array of, obviously lots of nonsense. The internet is full of things that you need to be able to, do some due diligence on, obviously, because, the mainstream media, people who are watching this show are probably familiar with the fact that the mainstream media is not something that you should unquestionably refer to.
I hope.
But
Yeah.
the same goes for the alternative media. I mean, the alternative media is full of nonsense as well. It has full of yeah. How do I
Scammers.
say?
Yeah. There's people capitalizing even on
And
this, on
yeah,
what we're talking
exactly. And
about.
doomers,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
as well, because how many people do you have on the alternative media that spread the word around like something beautiful is happening, like, many people are directly disobeying law enforcers, or are outright just they're physically rebelling against tyranny and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this, people can see that, this respect for authority is gradually fading away, because there is no foundation to it at all, and people are understanding that. But then along come these people from the alternative media, and you can debate about whether these people are doing it intentionally or not. But all these people saying, well, oh no, there's nothing going on here, folks. They know exactly what they're doing. They know full well what they're doing, and this is nothing, folks. They're always one step ahead, and you know there is no hope. There is nothing to do. We just sit in a corner and just and sit in your own despair. And that's very, very dangerous as well. And obviously, all of these people, when people with very large audiences as well, like, you have people like Russell Brand and, people coming on Joe Rogan to talk about things like anarchism and all of that, spreading these ideas. And, they have a very large following, and, people just shed it away by calling those people things like shills or controlled opposition. And I mean, like, first of all, what is the basis for your reasoning? I mean, that's obviously you'll find out that, because that person is, he has a background in Freemasonry or whatever, assuming that you know what Freemasonry is to begin with. But, it's all these non sequitur logical fallacies arguments and these guilt by association arguments that people make, instead of actually understanding that these ideas are being spread more and more around the world. And you have people have very, very large audiences and and are influencing so many people that are spreading these ideas that we're talking about, and that is the reason why there is so much hope. I mean, compared to decades ago, when people were full-blown nationalists, you had like the saying of my country, right or wrong, which means, I stand with my country even when we're the evil guys, basically. And now today, people are, back in the day, you can possibly be against, you can possibly suggest things like voluntarism in a world without slavery or rulership, or governments, and to use the language that is preferred. But you couldn't say that back in the day, but you would be scoffed at, and people would really disassociate from you. But now, people are not as emotional and are not as triggered. People actually are discussing these sort of things. These ideas are being talked about. And that's, the amount of people who are voluntarists today compared to decades ago is just phenomenal. In a span of decades, so many more people have become voluntarists and anarchists and have, understood more about, the non-aggression principle is the core philosophy behind everything, and we can do everything by way of voluntary interaction and mutual agreements and peaceful cooperation. And how do I say this? Back in the day, you can say that back then. You can be critical of the police, you can be critical of governments, but now look at people. They're having discussions all over the place now, and that's why they're so desperate. That's why they're pushing these sort of agendas all over the place, because they know more and more people are losing respect for their supposed authority and are more and more willing to just disobey. And when enough people disobey, that's when they lose their ground. They can't do anything once, let's say like 10% of an entire population stops paying tribute to the ruling class, stops paying taxes. I mean, in the US, where you're probably living at, Rick, it's like
Canada.
10. Oh, my apologies, Rick. But even taking something like the US. Yeah, of course. But like taking the US, 10% of the US, that's over 30 million people. I mean, are you having a bloody laugh? They're going to rob and prosecute 30 million people. Of course they're not going to do that. They don't have the resources nor the manpower to do that. And all of that, you cannot deny that all of that has come as a direct result of the internet, of the media that people have been able to share around through the internet.
And look how they're
And
trying to
that's
censor people too. That's what I look at too. Like they're doing their best to censor people. They're flagging videos. They're pulling channels down who are doing speaking truth. They fear that. They fear that. And
exactly.
that's what they wouldn't be censoring it if they didn't. So they truly, I think they see like, wow, we've really got to try to control this. They're not going to be able to. There's too many people doing it now, I believe. So, but they're trying, and you make great points, Alex. Like really amazing stuff that you're saying, and I hope people are going to think about things in the way that we're talking, because it really, when you start thinking about it, what we're living in is insanity. It really is, and I hope people stop. They see the illusion. Like I always hear people now. You got people because they're they vote for one person or another person, they think they're going to get different results. A lot of people I talk to are starting to realize like it doesn't matter who I vote for, it's all the same. And so they are
Oh
waking
yeah,
up. You're not. This
exactly.
isn't a voting. I say this all the time. This is not a voting problem that we have. This is, I call it a spiritual war, and this is a war. Like it's a spiritual war, and people have to start getting right with themselves and learning principles and learning all the things we talk about. Natural law, they have to learn the non-aggression principle. They got to learn what true anarchy is and stop looking for an external answer and an external ruler or somebody to tell you things. The answers are inside. I hope that makes sense. I hope I explained it right. But that's what I've always said. It's a spiritual war that we're against. This is not going to, what's happening in the world is not going to change by keep voting people in. It's never worked, and it's not going to work.
Of course. Well, what is the reason? How did we lose our freedom in the first place? By a bunch of politicians writing something down on a piece of parchment and
Mm-hmm.
doing all these political rituals and
Yep.
declaring that the politicians now have the right to rule other people. Well, obviously that doesn't make any sense at all. That is just ridiculous. It is beyond dogmatic.
For
So
sure.
the solution to that is to get some other guy in the office, tick a box next to his name, and get him to scribble on a piece of parchment that we now should have the right to do things that we would normally have the right to do anyway. Well, no, thank you,
It's
because
so
no
true.
scribble on a piece of parchment, and no politician can ever grant me the right to be free, nor does anybody can grant you the right to be free as well, because you're free regardless of who is sitting in Washington D.C. or Canada or The Hague or
Yeah.
whatever, wherever place you're
Mm-hmm.
in. You're free regardless of what they wrote down on a piece of paper or what political rituals they performed. And your freedom, the right to be free, is inherent to your very existence as a sovereign human being. And no politicians and political rituals can ever grant you that.
Well said.
And to look for a politician to grant you freedom is the same as a slave looking for a slave master that will free him. It's
Great
it's
point.
it's no difference.
There is no difference, and to bring this, let's bring this full circle because I want to end. I want to end on a definitely to try to get a positive and look on things. And I wanted to ask you. So, what are some of the solutions you think that we people can do that are just that learning about this and hearing what we're saying? What are some of the solutions that people have to do to start putting things in the direction the proper way, like to like just what do you think people need to start doing, I guess, is a good way to put it.
Well, obviously, that's since we've put the whole political activism thing out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Since that's obviously never going to grant you freedom. Well, what will it do? Well, the only way people are going to be free is by freeing people in their own minds. And the way you free people's minds is not by, of course, like so many people have this where they're trying to explain things to people. They're trying to, everything that we've talked about, explain all these concepts and philosophy. Well, the problem is, Rick, and not many people like to think about things.
Yeah.
Probably,
Yeah.
the vast majority of people doesn't. The vast majority of people don't like to think about things at all. They don't like to think at all. So, people who, like you and me, for instance, who like to philosophize, who like to intellectualize, who like to debate, who like to know the truth and and want to be morally and logically consistent and strive to live by the very principles of natural law, like you just said.
Mm-hmm.
it's, people like you and me, well, obviously we're going to be very, very open and interested to these type of ideas, but the vast majority is not. So by explaining it to people, by lecturing it at people, obviously that hasn't been successful for many people, you know, as far as my own experience goes, as far as everyone's experience has gone, because you might up pushing people a little further anyway, like, trying to lecture at people and trying to tell people how it is, trying to, well, not to, sound condescending or anything, Rick, but as if you're using them as a sort of stage that has to listen to your lecture, so to speak.
Right.
Well, obviously those people are not going to feel like you're listening to them. When you're trying to sit them down and explain to them how everything is supposed to work, do they think that they feel listened, and do they feel the intention that they would rather prefer to have during a conversation? No, that they're listening to someone else lecturing to them, and they would rather grab any opportunity they can to interrupt you or run away.
It's very true.
And
You're right.
and that's why it shouldn't be about you lecturing at them. Of course, we all especially people who love to debate and love to discuss these sort of things and love to philosophize, love to go on tangents and explain all of these, and wax eloquent about all of these philosophical topics. But most people don't like to think about these things. So the only way to get that through to people is to bring it out of them. And already that, what do you mean by that? Bring it out of them. I thought, but the thing is, every person, this is going to sound sketchy, Rick, but trust me, you'll understand what I mean. Every person most people, every decent person on planet Earth is a voluntarist and an anarchist by nature.
I get it.
And that sounds very, very strange, since you can't even get these ideas through to them. So how does that make any sense? Well, the thing is, voluntarism, all it means is is that everything has to be done by way of mutual consent, and that you cannot impose something on other people with violence. You cannot steal people's money. You cannot force people to do things that you would rather want them to do that they don't want to do. People already know that. People have a moral conscience that knows that stealing is bad, that forcing people to do things is bad, that using violence against other people to impose your will on them, not to defend against aggression, but to enforce something on people, people already know that that's wrong by default. Yep. That's what people have a moral conscience for. And that's what, the thing is, that's what is kept, well, it's not dormant, I wouldn't say dormant, but, they are kept in a place of, how do I say, there is two diametrically opposite things inside of their own heads.
Right.
That are not supposed to be there. That actually, how do I say this? By way of just asking them questions. If you can ask a specific way of questions to them by starting from the beginning, and I'm talking like from the very basis, if you can ask them certain questions, and this is the key actually, if you ask them questions instead of lecturing at them and telling them how it is, yep. You'll see that they get intrigued, because now somebody actually wants to know what I think. Someone actually wants to listen to me and wants to know what I believe, and actually cares about what I think, instead of someone trying to tell me what I should think, if that makes sense.
It does.
That's
a great point.
And also you have a bit of ego there, like people love when they're the ones being asked questions. Hey, he wants to know things about me. People are already prone to, participate in something like that much more than they would if they had to listen to your lecture, without even wanting to.
That's a great point. Great points. Wow.
Exactly. And if I can maybe just give a brief demonstration of it, like it's very, very concise. Obviously we don't have the time to break it all down, but
Yeah,
if
just
you can
simple
just
questions. Yeah, like I would love to give an example because you're right. I know in my own experience when I first started trying to do this, I think everybody goes through this. You want to tell everybody, you want to sit them down, you want to tell exactly like you said, Alex. You want to tell them how it is. And then I found out the hard way that you lose people that way or you push them so far in the opposite direction. What I did learn, and people have told me, like I've learned this from other people, and it definitely does work, is exactly what you're saying. Start asking them questions and get them to answer these questions, and it's something, it'll start to click. Because they're thinking, it's like everything you just said is perfect because it does work, guys. And I know this from experience. When I engage somebody and start asking questions and having them answer it, and we have a dialogue back and forth, that is where the magic is. That's where we have to be. So I just want to add that in because it's true for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Rick, and I'm glad you pointed that out. It's one thing that we also have to keep in mind is that you have to look at yourself more than you have to look at the other person, because actually, this is going to sound pretty pretty strange, Rick, but I don't want anyone to feel offended because it's not supposed to be. I'm not saying it that way.
Okay.
When we're talking to other people and they get into they get annoyed by you, or they feel like it's a discussion and they run away, or get all emotional. It's probably because we did something wrong, not because they did something wrong. Right. And it's because we didn't pay enough attention to our own psychology to realize that if you're going to let's say that people's mindset is also very important. When you look, this is also why I never use, like the terms awake and sleep, awake or, asleep, like we're the people who are awakened and enlightened, and those are the sleeping sheep, you're already making a dichotomy in your own head that is going to, make a distinction when there isn't any. It's just, it's all of us. That we're all brothers and sisters here, and there is just a bunch of us that have been tricked into believing something that isn't true. And once you shed away that dichotomy in your own head of us versus them, it isn't us versus them. It is them versus their own the indoctrination that they've been taught since a very young age. Right. From a very young age, and that's the fight. The fight is not supposed to be between you and them. If you get into a fight with somebody, immediately if you go up to somebody with the energy of like, yeah, this is going to be a discussion. You're already in like a battle mode, as if you're going to have a debate with someone. They will pick that up. Trust me, they will recognize, like, oh, is this going to be a discussion? Well, come on then. Show me what you got. Yep. And that's usually, or they just run away. Yeah. Because that's basically that's one thing that you need to keep in mind about your own psychology. Don't think as if you're going to have a debate or a discussion, because asking people questions is not a debate. One thing that we have to realize as well is that you cannot change people's mind. You cannot, well, I say free people's minds, but we're not actually freeing them. They are freeing themselves. Agreed. We can only set the condition for them to free themselves, if that makes sense. We can set the stage. We can create the condition in such a way that to get them to think about certain things, which will activate, which will snap the cogs in the machine, so to speak, with all the spider webs in it and all of that. That it's finally activating. They're actually thinking about something that they've never thought about before. And that's, if you ask specific that's basically some very basic rules. Look at your own psychology. Don't think that it's a debate or a discussion, and focus on them. You're not trying to convince people of something. This is another thing. We're not here to convince people of anything. If you want someone else to be freed from the illusion that they've been taught, it isn't a matter of convincing somebody of anything, because they will it is about them understanding that there is no such thing as an authority on or a right to use violence and aggression against people against without their consent,
Right.
and to oppress other people and steal other people's money without their consent. There is no such right, and once people understand that, that's when you don't need to convince people of that, because people already know that, and that's why asking. I'm going on a bit of a tangent here,
That's
but
okay.
I
No, I
hope
love it.
I hope I'm being clear here for those of you who might think that I'm staying in the same area a little bit. But to move on a little bit, is to say that is. If you ask them a specific line of questioning, that will get them to think about things, and you will. It is all about them. It is all about asking them what they think. It's
Yes.
all about what they think. It's not about what we think. We're not here to impose something on other people, impose what we believe or what we think on other people. It's about what they think, and the beauty about the beauty and the hope that there actually is, that we will inevitably, not that there is a chance, but it is inevitable that we will live in a stateless society in the very very near future, or probably in my lifetime, hopefully,
Yeah,
in,
I
a,
hope.
in our lifetime, and I would die to see it, obviously, but and that's why we're doing this, but the reason why there is that hope is because people are voluntarists and anarchists by nature. Because everybody knows that that scribbles on pieces of parchments, various political rituals and majorities, and changing the words around doesn't give anyone the right to rule other people.
Right.
And I've done these questions, like, I've done these lines of questioning in my videos, like the video that I just pointed out, like, is democracy the same as freedom? Well, at the beginning, I give a brief explanation of what democracy is and why a majority could never give any permission for a minority. But then I go into a very specific line of questioning that will get people to think about things. Excuse me.
Amazing.
And get people to think, like, wow, I can't answer these questions without contradicting myself, because that's the goal. Getting them to think about the contradiction in their own head, getting them to think about the two things that they simultaneously believe. I believe that it's wrong to steal from people, and that I cannot force my neighbor to hand over money so that I can fund an education system, or the poor, or a defense system. But governments and authority and the law and delegation and what have you not, these two do not match together. And we could do another episode of this if you want,
would love
Rick,
to.
where we can get into this specific line of questioning. Where I could give just a few examples that could be very useful for people, and some useful resources and courses, because people have talked about this many times, like Larkin Rose with the candles in the dark method. It's I believe when people understand this way, this method of trying to spread voluntarism, then you will get a lot further than where you are now, trying to convince people and trying to explain things incessantly,
Right.
which will eventually lead nowhere other than pushing people away in
It's
sometimes.
so true, and I know that, like I was saying earlier, I know that from experience. As soon as I started putting it in questions and really engaging with the person, and asking them what they think, they immediately got interested, and then the conversation went way better than me just trying to lecture to them. So I love what you're saying, and that is so key. Is that just break it down into questions, and then really focus in on what they're saying, and then it's always my hope too that in that process they're going to start answering these questions like you were saying, and then that is what I hope. It's my hope that then they'll go look out for more information in as they go forward. It's kind of like what happened to me. I kind of heard some things, and I had the discussions, and I got thinking, and then it sent me on my journey to where I am now. And that's kind of what I hope with these interviews and talking to different people in person. I'm not trying to sell them anything. I always say I'm not trying to convince you. You don't have to believe everything I do. But it's my hope that through that conversation that they're going to at least go into it further, is my hope.
Exactly. And that's why, also, just a caveat on that, Rick, what you've said earlier about discussing symptoms and various, well, actually irrelevant things,
Right.
Will not get you very far, because the principles is what matters. Once people understand the principle that nobody has the right to rule, nobody has the right to nobody has an exemption from morality, there is no such thing as an authority. Once people understand those basic things and there is no legitimacy to it, then the people in politics and in governments, those are going to be looked at and treated as the thugs and thieves that they are. And they won't be, because that's why we are in the condition that we're now. That's why people are compliant and, just obey, because they believe that they have the authority to do so and that it's legitimate when they do it. But once people realize that there is no legitimacy to it and that there is no such thing as an authority to do blatantly immoral things, then people will start realizing that then people will actually start treating them as the thugs that they are, and that's what's happening around the world right now, because people don't treat law enforcers and people of the state as they did like decennia ago, like tens of years ago, like in treating them with respect, and like Ayn Rand used to say, like giving the sanction of the victim. Mm-hmm. And now people are not doing that. People are actually very, very pissed off when they encounter police and all of that. And that's why there is such a low turnover rate at the police office, even here in the Netherlands, in the United States, all over the world. More and more people are quitting the police force because more and more people hate the police, which is a beautiful sign, by the way. And the people who actually the people who join the police force, or become the unquestioning order followers of a bunch of politicians, they quickly they don't want to have a job where they're being harassed and where they're being cussed out and all of that, and nobody likes them. They don't like their job. They hate their job. It is very depressing, and they just do something else. Well, that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the progression that we're seeing right now, because more and more people are realizing, are treating them as the violent thugs that they are. And soon more people are going to treat them that way. And that's when eventually they will be ignored into irrelevance. And that's how it's going to fall. It's going to be ignored into irrelevance. There's not going to be a revolution. There isn't going to be anything spectacular. It's all just going to fade away. They're just going to be ignored into irrelevance.
I've said the same thing about government too. I said, like, we're never going to government. I've always said exactly what you're saying. What you just said about the police, Alex, is that it's the same thing with the government. That as more and more people realize how illegitimate it is, people are just not going to vote anymore. They're not going to be listening. They're going to, and it's just eventually it's just going to fade away. It's not. I think people have it in their head that one day they're going to snap their fingers and there's no government, and it's going to be total anarchy because there's nobody ruling. And I always say that's not how reality works. I mean, it's never just going to be gone. But what it will be, and you said it perfectly. I have to remember that because you summed it up better than I ever could, and you brought it up perfect. Is that it's going to fade into irrelevance? Like that's what's going to happen. As more and more people learn what we're talking about and then put it into practice. It's just there's not going to be a need for them, and they're just going to fade away. It's perfect.
Exactly.
Well
and
said.
Yeah, obviously everything is going to be a beautiful world based on voluntary interaction, peaceful coexistence, and mutual agreement. And people will, have to settle things like adults and make compromises. But I'm pretty sure once people understand the principles and understand, what we've been talking about today, and live by their own moral conscience and live by their own judgments, instead of deferring to some psychopath
Mm-hmm.
in DC or whatever, that's when the real humanity will flourish, when the real them will come out, and that's when we will actually have a beautiful, beautiful world. And
I
that's a
agree.
world that I die to see.
Me too. Wow. And I would definitely. I'm looking at the time. We really did a good one. This one. This was so powerful, Alex. I want to thank you once again for joining me. I want to definitely have you back for a part two. I really want to set that up. So
Definitely.
I'll reach out to you probably today, and I'm going to see because when we can set that up for. Because I have so many more questions and some things that we can talk about. Some questions to ask people. I got a whole other show that I would love to do with you. So you definitely welcome back. Before we wrap it up, do you want to let everybody know where they can find any of your work? Is there any, the floor is yours for the next couple of minutes to let people know everything about you, where they can find your work, your presentations, your interviews, anything you want people to know. Let them know.
Oh, thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate that. The main place where people can find my work is my website, which is realization.com. That's not realization as in realizing, but it's green language, so it's realization as in real eyes, real eyeballs Asian. And I hope that you can post the link in the
I will
description.
do.
And if there's things missing on my website because I'm redoing it a little bit and adding things to it, and it's pretty difficult for me to be all techie, but it's
Me too.
it's yeah, we all have these things. But if you want to be, my YouTube channel and all my you can find me on all various platforms as well. You can find me on YouTube with the same name, on Rumble, on BitChute, and Odyssey.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah, I hope people can explore some of the works that I've made, especially like my works on the truth about anarchy, and the video that I just made about is democracy the same as freedom, and we
Right.
will have so many more things that we will do.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, and I'll make sure I leave a link to all of that in the description, guys, to the interview that or the video that he's talking about. I'll have a link in there for you, and I will definitely get you back, Alex. Thank you so much, Alexander. I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to me and everyone else that's listening, because I think these are the topics that we have to discuss, and it's so important. So I think you're doing amazing work, and I'm really looking forward to
Thank
have
you.
you back for a part two, because it's going to be another great one. So I'll make sure that I set that up with you, and I'm looking forward to it. So just keep doing the great work, Alex. You're doing amazing stuff out there, and I'm going to keep following you and listening to you, and look forward to having you back for sure.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's my
Alrighty.
pleasure.
All right. And you take care, and I will definitely keep in touch with you, my friend.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. All right, guys, there we go. All wrapped up. What a powerful interview. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Such important topics that were covered, and I am really, really looking forward to having Alexander back for a part two. I'm going to set that up and get that ready, guys. Maybe in a month or so, I'm going to have him back, because we got important stuff here to talk about. So many more questions, but I didn't want to make it like a 3-hour video. I'm trying to kind of shave these down to about an hour and a half for you guys. So I will set it up for part two, guys, and it will be incredible. I'm already looking forward to it, because what a powerful discussion that we just had. And I hope it gets you guys thinking and questioning yourself and what you believe, and sends you on a journey of looking further into these topics and realizing all the things that we spoke about. And then just to realize that, where does your belief in government come from? Why do you believe the things you do? Just these questions that I had, that I'm sure you have, and it sends you on that journey. So thank you guys once again for joining me. I appreciate all of you guys. I really do. I mean, I really enjoy doing these interviews and learned so much. So thank you guys. Take care. I will be back with another interview coming up this Saturday. It's going to be with Will Keller. It is an incredible interview, guys. You're not going to want to miss it. This is a powerful one, and it was a no holds barred interview that I did with Will. Like, we went into all of the rough topics, and it was incredible. So you guys are going to enjoy that. That is going to be premiering this Saturday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, guys. So check it out, and I will see you guys very soon. Have a great day, great night, wherever you guys are. Stay safe, take care of each other, and remember, nobody is better at being you than you. You are the greatest.
Are you interested in the paranormal? Murder mysteries, cryptocurrency, and thought-provoking interviews? Then check out Crypt Rick's I've Been Thinking on YouTube, or every Monday night at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Studio A at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. Welcome to the Crypt.